to be a webinar focused on the Mother of God and on some of the historical apparitions of the Mother of God. So obviously we're going to pray something that is related to her veneration. And so I'm going to read as our opening prayer a couple of verses from the Akathist hymn. The Akathist hymn was composed in the 7th century in Constantinople to honor the Mother of God. So this is what we'll begin with. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As soon as the angel had received his command, he hastened to Joseph's house and said to the ever-Virgin, "Behold, heaven was brought down to earth, when the Word himself was fully contained in you. Now that I see him in your womb, taking a servant's form, I cry out to you in wonder. Rejoice, O bride and maiden ever pure." An archangel was sent from heaven to greet the Theotokos, and as he saw you assuming a body at the sound of his bodiless voice, O Lord, he stood wrapped in amazement and cried out to her in these words, "Rejoice, O you, through whom joy will shine forth. Rejoice, O you, through whom the curse will disappear. Rejoice, O restoration of the fallen Adam. Rejoice, O redemption of the tears of Eve. Rejoice, O peak above the reach of human thought. Rejoice, O depth, even beyond the sight of angels. Rejoice, O you who have become a kingly throne. Rejoice, O you who carry him who carries all. Rejoice, O star, who manifests the sun. Rejoice, O womb of the divine incarnation. Rejoice, O you through whom creation is renewed. Rejoice, O you through whom the Creator becomes a child. Rejoice, O bride and maiden ever pure. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, this evening, I am, through the marvels of technology, connected with you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I am on a little vacation break. And of course, those of you who have been in Santa Fe are very much aware of how deep the Spanish cultural background runs in these parts, and so it was very interesting in preparing for this talk. We went to visit a church here in Santa Fe in the city, which is the oldest church dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And it is a sanctuary church, and I did actually bring even some pictures. So you can see the retablo in the back is actually an enormous painted canvas that was brought to Santa Fe in the 1780s, and it tells the story of the apparition of Our Lady to Juan Diego, and then of course her manifestation on the tilma. So this is for us in America, in the Americas. This is an apparition that is very close to our hearts and to our history, and so but the history of apparitions of the Mother of God goes back way back, and I think that's something that people get a little bit surprised about when we actually dive into the history. This is not a recent phenomenon, and so when Catholics tend to be more aware of apparitions that are somewhat recent, and so of course things that have happened between Fatima, Lourdes, and even like Medjugorje, and the other ones, some that might be older even than that, but the experience of these apparitions goes way back, all the way to the beginning of the history of the church. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to begin just with a little bit of a theological background, because one of the mistakes that I see happening amongst pious individuals who are very devoted to apparitions is that they get sometimes stuck on the person of, especially talking about Marian apparitions, they get stuck on Mary. And one of the very important elements is that Mary's apparitions, Mary's place in the church, Mary's place in the gospel tradition, Mary's place in theology, even all of her titles, are completely about Jesus, always in reference to Jesus. And so when people get a little bit attached to Mary in a specific apparition and then can't kind of see Jesus through her words, through her image, it becomes problematic, because it their theology can get a little bit askew, and devotion, even faith, even devotion and piety can become more focused on Mary than on Jesus and God, and there lies a big problem. And so I'm just going to briefly restate some of the, in a kind of a catechetical fashion, the basis of our theology when we're looking at Mary, the Mother of God. So in God's plan of redemption, there is only one special human being, one person, Mary, a teenager who had been promised in marriage to Joseph, a carpenter. By her yes, she received in her body, her womb, the divinity by the power of the Holy Spirit. God, who cannot be contained, was contained in her womb. Mary offered her whole being to God, her personality, her body, her spirit. And God is now, through her, in immediate contact with his creation. The love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit needed to generate life in order to share love. God said, "Let it be," and the universe came into being. God created sun and moon and stars. God created planets and the earth. Then he created mountains, oceans, trees, and animals. And he created man and woman as the crown of creation. He gave them free will. Humanity somewhat rejected what God asked of them, and sin and its consequences were brought about. But God could not turn against his creation, a creation brought about by his love. His plan to become one of us is in everything except sin, so that we might become like him. This is what we call theosis, divinization. God's plan involved a human being, a young woman, to be mother, to give him his flesh. Our understanding of Mary flows from our understanding of Jesus. Mary gave him flesh, nourished him within her body for 9 months, and gave birth to him. She fed him with her milk and taught him how to be human. She is mother. She is the mother of Jesus. She is the mother of God. The divine motherhood of Mary has been celebrated in the church from the earliest history of Christianity. From the 2nd century, Mary already was called Theotokos, a word which means she who gave birth to God. And so this is what leads up then to some of both the apparitions and some of the difficulties. The title of Theotokos, just as a little bit of a refresher so that we have that context, because it does appear over and over again. The title of Theotokos was popularly used before the Council of Ephesus that gave us the official blessing for the use of the word Theotokos. And however, the reason why it was necessary for the title Theotokos to be blessed by the authority of an ecumenical council was because one of the patriarchs of Constantinople, a man named Nestorius, who was elected Archbishop of Constantinople in the year 428, he did not like the word Theotokos. And so he saw this expression as a confusing expression that tempted one to mingle divinity and humanity, confusing the clear separation of the two in the person of Jesus. And so he wrote, "Let no one call Mary Theotokos, for Mary was only a human being, and it is impossible that God should be born of a human being." And so he taught that the titles that could be used to describe Mary were Anthropotokos, or the birth giver of a man, or Christotokos, the birth giver of the Christ, in that sense, the anointed one or the Messiah. And of course, flowing from this, he also was of the mindset that divinity somehow was infused into Jesus's humanity at some point after Jesus's birth. And so many of his followers looked at the event of the baptism of Christ as being that moment of hypostatic union, the union between divinity and humanity in Jesus Christ. Now, of course, the Council of Chalcedon and Ephesus, both of these councils clearly rejected this as heresy. And the affirmation of the title of Theotokos was finally proclaimed in Ephesus with these words. These are from the proceedings of the Council of Ephesus. "We confess and proclaim that our Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten of the Father, is real God and real man. He is composed of soul, reason, and body. In regard to his humanity, he was born of the Virgin Mary. For us and for our salvation he was born. He is of one essence with the Father, according to his divinity, consubstantial with us according to humanity. The union of divinity and humanity was a real unity in him. Therefore, we recognize but one only Christ, one only Son, one only Lord. Because of this union without any confusion, we confess that the Holy Virgin is Theotokos. God the Word was made flesh, he became man, and he united to himself, since his conception, the temple of our human nature, which he assumed from her. Mary is his mother, his birth giver, therefore she is Theotokos." And so the declaration is quite clear, and the rejection of Nestorius was also quite final. All his works were condemned and burned, and he went down in Christian history as being heretical. Not so much because it was about against Mary, but his teaching impacted how he understood who Jesus is. And so we just want to share with you from the 8th century a clarification written by St. John of Damascus. The Word did not take his divinity from Mary, but the Word who had been with the Father from eternity took flesh from her when the time of the incarnation had come. And this is in his dissertation, his writing on the Orthodox faith. So the importance of Mary as Theotokos has been something close to the mind of the church, and also in the middle of some of the controversy in the history of the church. So what I'd like to do tonight is to share with you a little bit about these different apparitions that you might have been familiar with. It's just going to be a little bit of an introduction. On some, I have a little bit more information than on others. But nonetheless, still quite an interesting topic, because these apparitions literally begin with the very beginnings of the church. The first apparition, and there I'm trying to kind of keep it in chronological order, however, it doesn't really always work out. So because there is a little bit of overlap with some of these apparitions. The first apparition is chronologically the first apparition, and it is actually an apparition that has to do with Mary appearing to the Apostle Thomas. According to the church's history, earliest history, related to the Feast of the Assumption, or in the East, the Dormition, when the Mother of God was living close to Gethsemane. So if you've been to the Holy Land, there is a site, it is a Benedictine monastery dedicated to the Dormition of the Mother of God. And it is a place, according to the church's tradition, where Mary was living and where she died or fell asleep in the Lord. And this site was overlooking the Kidron Valley, the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was a special place for her. According to Jewish tradition, the Kidron Valley is the place where final judgment will begin. And so it is, we could say it is probably historically the world's largest cemetery, with some 3,000 years of burials taking place there up until this very day. And so Thomas arrived, the other apostles came to be around Mary and were there when she died, but Thomas was not there, and he arrived late after she had already been buried in a tomb. Similarly to Christ, she was buried in a tomb of stone, not in the ground. When Thomas arrived, he asked if the apostles would accompany him so that he could pay his respects to Mary and see her body. And so they accompanied him to the tomb, and when they opened the tomb, the body was not there. And all that could be perceived was a strong scent of flowers, and some would say like a scent of paradise. And so Mary later that same day appeared to the apostles. So this is the first apparition. And she told the apostles that her body had been taken up to heaven. She gave to Thomas her belt. And we do have that actually depicted in a number of different versions. So this is a recent iconographic depiction, unfortunately very small, which shows Mary handing Thomas the belt, and then in the tomb we see flowers, the cave, which is the tomb. But let's look at another depiction historically. So this is 13th century, I believe, Giotto di Buoninsegna, from Siena, showing again the Assumption of Mary, and in her right hand you can see what looks like a cord, and that would be her belt. And interestingly enough, on her physical form there is no belt around her waist, so it's clearly depicting that being given to Thomas. And this is by one of the Italian Renaissance masters, showing the same thing. Again, Mary dropping the belt. And it's not specifically to Thomas because all the other apostles are depicted, but according to tradition, it was given to Thomas. Now, Thomas took this belt with him to India, where church tradition does in fact preserve in India pieces of the belt, so little parts that had been taken off of the original belt. And however, the belt eventually found its way to Urfa in today that area of Turkey which borders with Syria, where the conflict is kind of all crazy. And so it was brought there to the city of Urfa or Edessa in the year 394. Then from there, because of the Persian invasion and destruction of Edessa, it was taken to the city of Homs in Syria, which is just north of Damascus. There it was enshrined in a church that was specifically dedicated to the Mother of God and her holy belt. And this church has had the relic since then. When Crusaders came through that area, so they received a piece of the belt also, and that is why the cathedral in the city of Prato, Italy, has a piece of the belt. And also one of the monasteries on Mount Athos in Greece also has a piece of the belt. It is the same belt. Interestingly enough, as happens very often with relics in the Middle East, because of the invasions, because of the persecution often of Christians, some of these relics end up being hidden, and then the Christians don't know where they hid them. And so then they have to look for them. And it's, sadly, it is something that has happened often enough, especially when there are forced migrations. And so one of the interesting things that has happened recently, in 1953, there was a remodeling of the Church of the Holy Belt of the Mother of God in Homs, and they took apart the old altar to lay a new floor, and underneath the altar they found a box from the 4th century that held within it the relic of the belt. And it had been buried there probably sometime in the 13th century. And so they kind of, I guess they thought they had the relic, they just weren't sure where it was. It's kind of like when you lose something at home. You know it's in the house, but exactly where, you're not sure. And so, however, it was found, and it has been actually tested scientifically. It is contemporary with the Mother of God, 1st century, Holy Land, and so it is one of those relics that has quite an interesting history. The belt appears in many places, and again, when you read it that it's in Athos or that it's in a cathedral in Italy, it doesn't mean that it's the whole belt. Usually it's a small piece of the belt. Sometimes in some places that little piece was put into another piece of cloth that was like the regular size of the belt, so that it would look more complete when the faithful came to venerate it. And I do have actually a few pictures from that also. This is the belt as it is preserved in Prato, Italy. And in this case, it is a small piece that is within a larger piece that is the belt. Then the other I mentioned on Mount Athos, it is held as a smaller relic in this jeweled box. So it is that long strip that you can see in the middle. And on the lid of the box, this box was actually given as a gift by one of the Tsars of Russia. And on the lid, you can see the depiction of the apostles at the tomb with Thomas and his hand upraised on the left side. And then the shrine in Homs, which is the church, unfortunately, sadly, was quite damaged during the Syrian civil war, and has been rebuilt. The relic of the belt was taken to Beirut, and now is back in Syria. And this is the room that holds behind the grate is glass, and behind that is the piece of the original belt. The same one that was found in 1953, and the same one that was brought there from Urfa or Edessa after around the year 400. So this is one of the, you could say this is the first apparition of the Mother of God. But there are others, and they do get pretty interesting. So another apparition, which happened very early, actually so early that it occurred during, we would say, during the lifetime of Jesus, was an apparition that occurred on the Capitoline Hill in the city of Rome. Octavian Augustus, one of the Caesars, was very popular, and the Senate wanted to deify him. They wanted to proclaim him as a god. And the Roman emperors, they have a rather colorful history with the whole thing of becoming gods. And so many were declared gods, especially after Octavian. But Octavian himself was troubled. He did not want to be proclaimed a god. And so he decided to pray for a sign. And according to the legend, after fasting for 3 days, he went and he prayed. And before his eyes, the sky opened up, and a woman holding a child appeared before him, surrounded by light. And the words that he heard were, "This is to be the altar of the Son of God." And so the Capitoline fortress where this occurred, that became a temple was built there by him that became known as Araceli. Araceli means the altar of heaven. And we are told that the emperor prostrated himself before the vision. And now, so this apparition would have occurred during the life of Jesus. It is preserved in pagan sources, and then it is a little more is told about this apparition through a Christian perspective. But the understanding was that this was, of course, Mary and Jesus. The church itself that is built there, so in the city of Rome, those of you who have been in Rome, this specific church, which is, I think, the current one a little later, but it is built on the foundation of an original church from the 4th, 5th century. This church is located kind of in the center of town, right next to the Roman Forum. And if you've been to Rome, there's this huge monument there that the Italians call the wedding cake. It's the tomb of the unknown soldier. It's this enormous white monument with pillars, very imposing, lots of stairs going up. And it faces the Piazza Venezia, the palace that was at one time the Embassy of Venice. And so it's right behind that. In the church, though, there are different relics also from the earliest Christian history. And there is an image of the Mother of God, which I will show you here. And it is the image of the Mother of God interceding. It is from the 6th century, and probably had to do with a monastery that was attached to this church, Araceli. And the monastery was supposedly a Greek monastery. And so that would explain why this icon would be found there. Here is also a view of the actual church as it appears today, with the altar all the way in the back where the icon is. And so Araceli is this second apparition. It is interesting because, of course, it happens within the context of pagan Rome. And I think many Catholics don't even realize that this is a story, an apparition that is historically relevant in the life of the church. And it was a way of also understanding that Mary already revealed, even to the pagan Octavian, revealed that Rome was to be a place where an altar would be dedicated to the Son of God. Now, There are other apparitions, lesser apparitions, that are preserved in different martyrologies and different stories of the saints. But I'm pointing out some of the main ones so that we have a little bit of a understanding of the different things that Mary has done in these apparitions. The third apparition actually is an apparition associated with the Council of Nicaea and Constantine. Constantine, when he legalized Christianity, he realized that the teachings of different bishops and priests were not all consistent. There were differing Christologies and theologies, and so to get beyond the confusion, he calls the Council of Nicaea outside of the city of Constantinople. And to this council come most of the bishops of the Mediterranean world. The Council of Nicaea gives us the entire list of what we believe, the creed, which we recite at every liturgy or every Sunday Mass. However, there was a big dispute around the person of Arius. Arius was a very pious priest. I've spoken about him before. He was an ascetic, but his theology was bad. And he was from the city of Alexandria. He earned the respect of many of the bishops. What he taught, although it was bad theology, he truly believed it. He truly lived by it. And so when he taught his theology, and he talked and shared it with the bishops at the Council of Nicaea, it caused such confusion. Many of the bishops who, before hearing him, were of Orthodox faith, they began to doubt. So compelling was his speech. And one of the bishops, we're told, one of the bishops, upon seeing his brother bishops becoming more open to Arius's teaching, one of the bishops stood up and punched Arius in the face. And that was Saint Nicholas, the same Saint Nicholas that we celebrate, the nice, gentle, old man bishop, fatherly figure, lover of children, the one who saved the daughters from prostitution and raised the dead, saved the sailors. Well, he also decked Arius. And the reaction to that was that Nicholas was arrested. Constantine knew that with differing opinions on theology, that there would be problems. And so he very clearly set kind of the ground rules. And when anyone would, how they should behave. And so since Nicholas acted aggressively, he had him arrested and he had his episcopal insignia removed. And so that would be kind of like his, not vestments, but he would have as part of his clothing, he would have, like the archbishops wear a pallium around the shoulder. And so something similar to that, or like the omophorion of the Byzantine bishops. So it was wrapped around his shoulders. That was removed from him, and he was thrown into prison. And so the story goes that during the night, Mary comes to Nicholas in prison And she tells him, "My son, what are you doing here?" And he answers to her, "I have been put here because of my great love for your son." And so Mary and Jesus go to Constantine, and Constantine has a vision of Mary and Jesus. And Mary tells him, and so Jesus isn't even talking in this one. Mary tells Constantine that Nicholas must be reinstated. And she holds in her hands his episcopal insignia, that stole that he wears around his neck. And Jesus is holding the gospel book. And so immediately Constantine has Nicholas reinstated, and it happens that a number of the fathers of the bishops gathered in Nicaea actually had that same dream that night. And so Nicholas was vindicated. And so here I'm going to share with you just a couple of images that speak to that event. Here is Nicholas getting ready to smack Arius. Took a long time to find that one. You would think every church would have that icon. Here on this icon, which is a recent icon, we actually see in the corners, and this is how St. Nicholas very often is depicted. We see Mary holding his episcopal insignia in her hand, and Jesus holding the gospel in his hand, giving it to Nicholas. And so when you see icons of St. Nicholas, this is specifically the retelling and the icon of the story of the apparition to Constantine. So that is another, that's the rest of the story when it comes, and I'm sure most of you have heard about Nicholas's conflict with Arius, but this is the rest of that story coming full circle. Then there are a number of other stories. So another apparition that happens in the city of Rome, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major, one of the basilicas of Rome. It contains within it an icon that I spoke about during the Lucan Madonna section, the icon of Our Lady Salus Populi Romani, the health of the Roman, salvation of the Roman people. The icon, which is considered to be one of the Lucan Madonnas, is in a church that was built in celebration of the Council of Ephesus. So it was built around the year 436 to 440. It has mosaics from that period also, some of the earliest of images of the Mother of God and some of the Old Testament images. And that church came about also as part of an apparition. Pope Sixtus, who wanted to build this church in honor of the Mother of God and dedicate it to the Mother of God, Pope Sixtus had some problems in working out a plan of how big this church should be. He and his architects could not come to an agreement. And so in the midst of figuring these things out, Pope Sixtus had a dream, and the Mother of God told him, directed him to go to this section of Rome, and she has chosen already where the basilica was to be built. And in the morning, he will find that snow has fallen in the shape of the foundation where that basilica would be built. And since snow was not common and it wasn't really the season for snow, that would be the miracle. And indeed, early in the morning, word had spread that on one of the hills of Rome, snow had fallen, but only in a specific pattern. And so that would become then the foundation of the church, and they marked it out there in that place. And the title that is also given to this apparition is Our Lady of the Snows. There is a shrine, I believe, outside of Chicago dedicated to Mary under that title. And so that's another, you're talking early apparition of the Mother of God. Then returning back to Constantinople, in Constantinople we have another story coming to us from the 5th century. A soldier who was serving in the Byzantine army returned to the city of Constantinople, and outside of the gate of the city, he encountered a blind man who was begging for water, and since he did not know the blind man, he did not know about bringing him into the city. He went and he searched for water right there around, outside of the walls, where there might be a well so that he could get him some water. This soldier heard he couldn't find any water, and he heard a voice that told him to go deeper into the woods outside of the city, and he will find water there. The voice instructed him, take some of the cloudy water in your hands, give it to the blind man to drink. Then take the clay that remains in your hands, that would be the source of the cloudiness, and put it on his eyes. Then you will know who I am. And so he did just that. And he realized that it was the Mother of God who was instructing him to do this. Then she told him that he one day would become the emperor. And he did indeed. He became the Emperor Leo the Thracian, who ruled from the year 457 to 474. As soon as he became emperor, he had his architects build a church on the spot of this spring of water where the miracle had occurred. And this title of the Mother of God is Mother of God, Life-Giving Spring, which is celebrated on the Friday after Easter. The church is still there. However, it has been destroyed and rebuilt a number of times. And I do have some photographs here to share. This here is an image of the icon. And this is a later icon, but it shows the Mother of God seated in the fountain of water, and then a blind man washing his eyes, and another man also touching the water. And if you notice in the fountain itself, there are fish. And that is because the water that comes from the spring has within it a unique type of fish that people will catch and dry and send to those who are far away. And so this is the spring here And that is the fish there. It is not that color. So it is not koi that is in this spring, but rather I think that was color enhanced so that one could see the fish. Bad choice of color. The fish is actually kind of a grayish fish, but it is dried and sent around the world to people who are asking for miracles. And this is a site that from 460 up until today is still drawing people, even though it's in the midst of the Muslim world. It's just outside the walls of Constantinople. Where it is located, the Ottoman emperors, the Ottoman sultans tried to discourage the pilgrims who had come there. And so they erected around the church a Muslim cemetery. And eventually the church was destroyed. But then, so only a small chapel was permitted to be there. However, at the beginning of the 19th century, the church was rebuilt on a smaller scale. And it is the place where the patriarchs of Constantinople are buried from the 1800s up until today. But it is still a place that is filled with much history and many miracles and many people who come there and pray. So that is, I think that's our fourth apparition. Yes. Then we'll skip ahead a little bit. This is an interesting kind of a double apparition. In the city of Constantinople, close to the royal palace, there was a monastery built in the 7th century called Blacherne or Vlacherne. And the monastery was very favored by the royal family because very often the elderly mothers, grandmothers would take vows and become nuns. And so many of the nuns who were in that monastery were actually from the royal family. And with them, they brought the favor of the royal court, but they also brought their own money. They supported the monastery. The monastery became very influential. It held within it an icon that was probably from the 7th century, and it was a rather bulky and large icon, not painted but done in relief. And the explanation that was given was that the icon contained within it, it contained the ashes of many martyrs who had been burnt. So they had died as martyrs, but unfortunately their bodies had been burned to ashes, and then these ashes were collected and they were put into this icon, which was then preserved in that monastery as a relic of these different saints. So Blacherne was very important already from that point of view and that historical time frame. So we're talking that's just in the 7th, 8th century. Blacherne then also in the mid-5th century, so about around the year 450, received as a relic the veil of the Mother of God. This was brought to the city of Constantinople by one of the members of the royal family who went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he found in the town of Nazareth, he found a Jewish widow who had a lot of knowledge of the history of the Holy Family in Nazareth. And he noticed that people were coming to her house. And in her house, she had one room which he wasn't permitted into. And so he asked around and he found out that people were going there because she had clothing from the Mother of God. And so he spoke with her and was able to obtain, and I'm not sure, I kind of get the feeling that it may have been forced from her, but he took from her the veil and brought it to Constantinople, where it was presented to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Saint Gennadios, and Emperor Leo, the same emperor who built the Church of the Mother of God life-giving font. This veil, the Patriarch then had analyzed, and with his experts, they decided that the veil was indeed authentic and matched with other similar pieces of cloth that the church had from other saints from that same period. And so the veil was then put in this church of Vlachernes. Vlachernes church is only a little piece of it is left. It's been, through Ottoman centuries, it's been greatly diminished, and the monastery destroyed, and the palace also. The relics, however, have been taken to other pieces, divided up, lost, and probably some even destroyed. The icon, we don't know where it is anymore. The veil of the Mother of God, there are different churches, both in the East and the West, that claim to have pieces of her veil. But the most important piece of history that we get out of this is there is an actual historical event that took place in the year 911. And this happened at the Church of Vlachernes. The city of Constantinople was surrounded by barbarian forces that were intent on taking the city, and the local inhabitants gathered around the relics that they had in the Church of Vlachernes. The Patriarch was presiding over an all-night vigil. All-night vigil is all of the monastic hours celebrated one after the other throughout the entire night. The tradition was that when the city was threatened, the Patriarch would take the veil and he would bless the city with the veil. We have a number of historical documents that tell us about this tradition, and we know that Patriarch Photius, Saint Photius, actually took the veil and dipped it into the Bosphorus before the city was attacked by a group of pirates. And dipping the veil into the water caused waves that overturned the ships of the pirates. And so there is a long history of this relic somehow protecting the city. And so the story that is preserved is that in the year 911, as they are praying in the Church of Vlachernes, a woman walks in with two men, and she walks up to the front of the church and kneels before the relic of the veil, and she prays there, and she is heard weeping. And then she stands up and she takes the veil into her hands and she rises to the ceiling with the two men who accompanied her. And there was an ascetic there in St. Andrew the Fool for Christ, who was present there, and he was the first one who received kind of the knowledge, the awareness of who she was. And he recognized that this was Mary, and that the two men with her were John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. And as the crowd began to realize this, the veil in her hands expanded and seemed to cover them all. And then she disappeared. And so, and of course, the city was saved. That goes without saying. And so this event has become part of the church's calendar, and is especially a feast loved among the Slavic people, and is celebrated on October 1st, so just recently, and is referred to as the Feast of the Protection of the Mother of God. And many churches are dedicated to that feast. And so that is another one of the Constantinopolitan feasts. Again, unfortunately, where all the relics are, where the veil is, all of that is part of the sad conquest of Constantinople, and then the dispersal of the many relics all around the Christian world. And so we really don't know exactly where these holy things ended up. Now, there are other important apparitions, and so one of the ones that I kind of, going through the endless, because they are indeed endless. So we think about the apparitions we know, and usually we can name a few of them, but there are, when you open up the books of Christian history, there are many different apparitions. Some are very significant, and some seem to be very minor. One of the apparitions that I wanted to share with you also, I think, is kind of interesting, because it is something that is, in a sense, there's a bit of recent history. If any of you have been to Fatima in Portugal, there was, from the 70s until around the year 2000, there was a Russian icon that was preserved there. In the retreat center, there is a Russian chapel, and as you know, Fatima has also a lot of significance, because the fact that Russia was mentioned, and communism and the consecration of Russia, all of that is something that is still being talked about by many of the faithful who follow the traditions around this apparition. One of the interesting things, though, is the presence of this icon, which was purchased in, I think it was the year 1971, was purchased by the Blue Army of Fatima. And it was an icon that had some history, although no one was sure if it was the original icon or not. So let's begin with telling of the story. In the year 1579, in the town of Kazan, the icon is known as the icon of Our Lady of Kazan. Kazan was an area that was part of Russia and the Russian Empire. However, after the 13th century and the invasion of the Mongol horde from the east, Kazan was primarily a Muslim city with a nominal presence of Christians. And so in 1579, a young girl, 9-year-old girl named Matrona, had a vision of the Mother of God. And the Mother of God instructed her to go to the ruins of a house, and there in the ruins she will find her icon. And so Matrona told her mother, and her mother told her, nonsense, you're just making this up. And so Matrona didn't do anything. And the Mother of God appeared again to her and asked her, did you go to find my icon? And Matrona said, no, my mother wouldn't let me. And so she told her, well, talk to your mother and go find my icon. And Matrona went, talked to her mother. Her mother talked to her father, who was a Russian military official. And both of them said that Matrona is making this up. And so they scolded her and sent her to bed. Matrona again had the apparition, and the Mother of God again asked her, have you gone to retrieve my icon? And Matrona said no, and then she said, my parents won't let me. And so the Mother of God told her that she has to convince them to go there, or something horrible will happen to her family. I love it. It's very Russian. And so Matrona goes and talks to her parents. Her mother tries to convince her, but they decide to take her to the priest to see if the priest could get some sense out of this. The priest goes and he listens to her story, and he's not sure what it means, but he takes the story to the bishop. And the bishop says, well, let's go with her to this place and see what happens. And so they go to the house, and Matrona steps into the ruins of this building, and she reaches down onto the ground and wipes the dirt away and pulls out immediately this icon of the Mother of God that was painted probably some 300 years earlier. The icon had probably been hidden there because it was not a home icon. It was an icon from a church. And so the icon was taken into the cathedral of the city, and then on the place where it was discovered, another church was built to have the icon in a monastery. And little Matrona, when she grew up, she became one of the nuns at the monastery. And that monastery became so famous that slowly Kazan changed from being Muslim, and it became Christian again. And it was very important too, because the Muslim civil authorities in Kazan and in that area, every time there was some natural disaster or some pandemic or some fire, they blamed the Christians. And so the general climate was very hostile to Christians. And when something happened, the Christians were blamed. They were persecuted, and some were even killed. So they were inciting anti-Christian sentiment among the population. And so when this happened and the news got out that the Mother of God had appeared to Matrona and that this icon had been retrieved from, the ruins of a building that had been destroyed, maybe even centuries before, that initiated the entire conversion of that region back to Christianity. And so, and the image of this icon of Kazan, it was preserved there, and copies were made of it right away. It became, in the 1580s, it became one of the biggest stories that was told in Russia and shared among Christians. And so the copies of the icons were produced, and churches were built dedicated to Our Lady of Kazan. Our Lady of Kazan became the second holiest icon of Russia. The holiest one was Our Lady of Vladimir, which was an icon that was brought to Kievan Rus, and later then to Moscow from Constantinople, and an icon that again was attributed to St. Luke. Even Our Lady of Kazan icon was also attributed to St. Luke, but there's no historical basis or possibility. And so on June 29th, 1904, the icon of Our Lady of Kazan was stolen from the monastery of Kazan in Russia. It was not part of the Russian Revolution just yet. It was, a good 10 years earlier. And because the icon had so many miracles attributed to it, around the icon and covering the icon was much gold and silver and diamonds and jewelry. And the icon was covered also with crowns made of precious metals and gems. And so I guess the main goal was to obtain some of those items. And the men who stole it, 2 men who eventually were caught, they had already unloaded a bit of the jewels. However, the icon was gone. It was never found. And one of the, I think the wife of one of the men actually confessed that she had cut the icon up into pieces and burnt it to destroy the evidence. And, but nobody seemed to believe that story. And so, there was much speculation that the icon had somehow been sold on the black market. There were, groups that would be willing to buy it, groups that didn't agree with the Russian Orthodox Church, and that might have taken advantage of that in order to take the miraculous icon away from the church. So there's a lot of speculation about that. So now flash forward to mid-1960s, an icon of Our Lady of Kazan with jewels from the 15th and 16th centuries, the same size, is discovered in Paris. It was somehow as part of a number of icons of value that had been moved out of Russia right at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. The family that owned the icon, there was no way of proving its provenance at this point. And, before 1904, they didn't really take pictures of the icon to show that it in fact was the exact same one. The icon ended up being put on the market for sale through one of the major auction houses. It was lent by the family. The family was a Russian family, so they loaned the icon to a number of Russian Orthodox churches, and it made a bit of a tour of these different churches, and both the Orthodox Church in America and the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, two separate bodies, were interested in purchasing the icon, as they put it, ransoming the icon. And so they were negotiating with the family when, out of the blue, literally, the Blue Army of Fatima bought the icon right out from under them. And this was like in 1972, 71, 72. Reportedly, they paid just over $6 million for the icon, which in 1972 was a lot of money. And so the icon was taken then to Fatima, and it was enshrined there in the Russian chapel. And it became kind of a banner, or even a trophy, to focus the prayer of the faithful to the conversion of Russia, to pray for the conversion of Russia, the fall of communism. And it was then offered to Pope John Paul II, and Pope John Paul II had hoped to personally take the icon back to Russia and give it to the Patriarch of Moscow. That didn't happen. There was a lot of politicking. There were many problems with trying to set that up. And so in 2004, the icon was brought to Moscow by one of the representatives of the Vatican, and it was handed over. And then the Patriarchate, they checked the icon out to see if it was in fact the original, and it was determined that historically it was not the original, but one of the first copies. And so the icon was then sent to Kazan, and to great pomp and circumstance, it was brought into the monastery church and put in the place of where the original had once been. And so it is, in a sense, even though it's a copy, it is one of the oldest copies, and it has advanced at least a little bit the whole notion of ecumenism and Christian unity. So let me share with you a couple of the photos so you can see the original icon. You may have seen it because the Blue Army of Fatima, as well as other organizations in the last 30 years, they have used the icon on many publications. And so those are all, the icon is studded with emeralds, which come from the region of Kazan. So that was one of that's one of the reasons why they thought this may be the original. However, it was probably copied from the original and still dressed in gold and pearls and emeralds. Another one of the icons, which is of the same image of Our Lady of Kazan and is considered to be the second oldest, and this here you get an idea of what she looks like without the gold covering. And this icon is found in the Church of Our Lady of Kazan in Moscow, which was built around the year 1600, and this icon is from around that time too. So the image of the Mother of God of Kazan shows Jesus standing probably on his mother's knee, although the icon is cut there, so we don't know what the exact position is. her hands are not visible, and his left hand is wrapped in the cloak, and sometimes we'll see a scroll also being held there, but only his right hand is visible in blessing. And so this icon, I decided to bring this icon to and kind of close with it because it's an interesting apparition of the Mother of God that begins in a completely Russian setting. It historically has nothing to do with Europe or the West. And yet in its later history, it becomes connected to Fatima, and then Pope John Paul II, and and really all the way through to our day. I think that is one of the high points of the relationship, which has been very testy between Rome and Moscow. That is one of the high points when that icon was given, and the Russian Church has also in different ways reciprocated. So the relationship, although it's not the greatest, it's also not that bad. And I think that's one of the beautiful fruits of these apparitions, is that they although they happen in history, they continue to speak to us. When I went to Istanbul, Constantinople, the first time, I was in college, and I went and asked, I didn't know where this place was. I couldn't find anyone who knew where it was. And so I asked, Mother of God, life-giving font. I explained the story to people, who I met, the concierge at the hotel, asking anyone who would know. And of course, Turkey being primarily a Muslim country, that's not common knowledge for most Muslims. And I found my way to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, and there I had an audience with the Patriarch, and I asked him. And so he told me, he called over his secretary, who was a young deacon, Father Tarasios, a native of San Antonio, of all places, and he wrote down for me the name and then how to say the area of town, how to say that in Turkish, and then he gave me his office phone number, so that in case I get lost, I can call him up. And so I was able to find the place, and I had to walk through miles of cemetery, because that was all a Muslim cemetery now, outside of the walls. There are no signs or anything, but I did find it eventually, and it was really a beautiful experience, because although one could say that it was suffocated, it's been reduced. The original church is not there anymore. It's just a smaller church. Stepping into that place, it was an oasis. It was a place where you felt the presence of God. You felt the presence of Mary. And going down to that beautiful turquoise water that is still, cool and flowing and bubbling, after 1,600 years from the apparition, that it was just, it's like everything I went through was okay. It was worth it. I forgot all of the bad stuff and all of the confusion, and just realize that these apparitions, they do have a very special place in the history of the church. And there are many apparitions. There are many more, and there are apparitions that are still happening. And I think even events like weeping icons or bleeding statues. These are all apparitions. God is trying to send us some message through his mother. And, and so it is important that we find affirmation and solace in these moments, in these words, in these apparitions. But it is also important that we see the presence of God. It's not about Mary. The focus ultimately has to always point us, direct us to God, his plan, and his son. And so, that's, I thought it would be interesting just to open up this chapter and look at some of these apparitions, because although they, sometimes are controversial and there may be issues and problems, there is a long history, and God has spoken to us through his mother. And there is definitely an affirmation that happens. I mean, consider the one that should be closest to us, Our Lady of Guadalupe. My friends in Mexico who are priests, who have studied this phenomenon, there's so much that can't be explained about it. The one thing that really struck me that I did not realize was that at the time of the apparition of Mary, or right before the apparition, the Spanish were losing their control, their establishing of the faith. Here it was tragic. It was not going to happen. And so, but the apparition, the presence of the Mother of God completely changed that. And so, so it's an interesting phenomenon of what these apparitions mean in the life of the church. And there are apparitions that are happening in the Middle East, in areas that are, suffering, and areas where Christians are persecuted. And, these messages, these occurrences, they affirm the faith of the people there. And, so I say it's worth it to understand some of these events in the history and the life of the church, and to take from them something to affirm faith, something to build up what God has started in us. And that's why I think it is worth it to appreciate this history. So, any questions?
What is the meaning of the belt? Why the belt?
Well, I think when it comes to the attire of a Middle Eastern woman, her giving the belt would not compromise her modesty.
Okay.
So, like, removing her veil would be an immodest act, because a woman in the Middle East does not reveal her hair. And any other article of clothing, I don't think that would work either. And in the Middle East, culturally speaking, also, footwear, shoes, sandals,
No,
that's not considered a good thing. So you don't leave that behind as a relic. Remember when President Bush had a shoe thrown at him in the Middle East? That's a big insult. And so Mary would not be leaving behind shoes either. So I think the belt is probably an article of clothing that would not compromise, her modesty.
Okay. The second one, what did the Virgin told, or the apparition told to Octavius in Rome?
The words that are recorded as a part of the story are, "This is the altar of the Son of God." The Octavius was at the place where the plan was to build a temple dedicated to him. And so the altar would be of Octavius. And so that was the, that's what was challenged when the apparition spoke. Interestingly enough, in the recorded histories, we're not sure if those words were spoken by Mary or they were spoken by God, because it's imprecise as far as the gender of the speaker.
So 2 more questions, Father. Why is it that the apparitions are mostly about the Virgin? Mostly in the whole world, in the past, now, everywhere.
Well, I think, this would be just my kind of opinion. I think that Mary is seen as an intermediary between humanity and divinity. She is, in a sense, more connected to us because she is one of us, whereas Jesus is one of us, but he is also God. Yes. So there's a little bit of a separation that happens more in our thought process when we analyze that relationship. It shouldn't be that way, but I think by human nature it occurs that way. And plus, you think about it, if you look back at your childhood, usually if a child has a problem or is scared, where does the child run? Usually to mom.
Yes.
And so there's already that kind of natural relationship, and I think that builds on it.
So another question, I believe it's the last one. Why is it that wherever the Virgin appears, there's a spring of water most of the time?
Well, water is life. Any place in the world where you find a city or town or village, there has to be water. No water, no life. And then, of course, from a Christian perspective, water is a symbol of baptism, which is new life, and it is the water that one drinks and one will never thirst. And so it's the promise of eternal life. And so, as a symbol, I think that's very, very consistent with the gospel tradition. Water has a unique place. We use water to bless things. Water is used to cleanse things in the Old Testament. The Jewish form of confession is through water, living water, so a spring of water, not stagnant. And so that water has that kind of a versatility of meanings that enriches the experience of God, that reminds us of the promises that God has made.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Father, this Thomas is the same that said, "Unless I put my finger on the side of..."
Yep.
So maybe our Holy Mother knew that he needed physical.
Well, that's, it is a bit, he is called Doubting Thomas. And so, he's got, just because of that one time, he's now got a reputation. So yes, that's, it could be.
But it's good for us because he is in a way, he allowed us to have all that evidence in his doubting. And
well, and in many things, he does represent us. He presents our questions sometimes. So
I have a question.
Yes, Karen.
Okay, so you spoke of Mary going to sleep in the Kidron Valley. What is it true that she was in Ephesus with John at one point in that house that they have in Ephesus?
Well, the tradition is that she did go with him to Ephesus and live there for a time, but then towards the end of her life, she was drawn back to Jerusalem. And so she was living in a house which was, they say, his house in Jerusalem. And that house happened to be right at the wall of the city overlooking the whole of the valley. And of course, that valley was special because that was also where the Garden of Gethsemane was. And in fact, that's where her tomb is. It is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so, and those are the two places when you go to the Holy Land, the two places that are associated with her life. The place where she died, or it's called the place of her dormition, where she fell asleep in the Lord. And then the place where she was buried, although she was not buried there for good. It was from there that her body was assumed to heaven. And so, but yeah, John traveled, you know, he establishes the church there in Ephesus. The history around that house is very convincing. There is a lot of information that confirms her presence there with him. And he did take her to himself after Jesus's ascension.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been to the house in Ephesus, and you know, there's water there also, and I agree. It was very convincing, and you felt a presence there.
Yeah, I have more issues with the whole flying house thing. That I'm not yet sure about. So,
In Italy?
you know, Loreto in Italy.
Loreto.
Follow, yes. There is a book which is also a very interesting read, and it is this book called Relics.
Uh-huh.
And it has some information about some saints also and where they are, but also some icons and images. It is by Joan Carroll Cruz. And interesting, it's not complete. There are a few pieces that are missing, but it definitely is interesting in finding out like where different saints are buried, how they got there, then some of the stories about things like you know, the chalice from the Last Supper and places that claim to have that too. But it's a pretty interesting read, and the story of Araceli is mentioned in there too. Okay, well, it was my pleasure seeing you all this evening.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. Next week, I believe we will be talking about some theological issues, specifically some of the arguments that happened between the East and the West around the 8th and 9th centuries, and some things that are also topics still being tossed around today, unfortunately, but it'll give a little bit of context. The main issue will be the iconoclasm, which in the Christian East try to redefine a theology of images. In some ways, it's related to the Protestant Reformation because some of the themes are echoed there. But in other ways, it is completely unique because it was, I believe that it was initially an attempt to make Christianity look closer to Islam, so without images. And because that was the first encounter between Christians and Muslims on a battleground. And so, but it's interesting how it became a whole theological current and issue. So, but that'll be next week.